Welcome to episode 3 of Steaming Along the Line. I'm your host, Zach McGinnis, and thank you for joining us. Today, we're going to talk about a locomotive that really needs no introduction in the steam excursion world. This engine has powered passenger trains all over the eastern United States and hauled thousands and thousands of passengers. The locomotive today is Nickel Plate Road 765. Before we dive into the 765, we want to go back in history a little bit to Lima, Ohio, and the Lima Locomotive Works. The Lima Locomotive Works is really where superpower design started for the steam locomotive industry. Now, you might ask, what is superpower? So today we're going to go a little bit in the history of developing the superpower concept into steam locomotive technology. In the late 1920s, the railroads were getting bigger, trains were getting longer and heavier. The big engines were considered 210-Os, 280s, and even the 282s of the World War I USRA designs were around. But the railroads decided they needed something bigger and talked to the locomotive builders at the time. You had Alco, American Locomotive Company, you had Baldwin, and you had Lima. Those were the big three. Even though the Lima Locomotive Works was the smallest of the big three companies, they had something that the other ones did not have. They had a gentleman named W.E. Woodard, who was the vice president of engineering in Lima. Even though many in the industry felt that steam had topped out, Woodard and Lima pushed the envelope a little bit. And essentially what they came up with was the 284 wheel design. You had your 2 pilot trucks, you had your 8 drive wheels, and your 4 wheels on the trailing truck that supported a larger firebox, which made more heating area to make higher steam, and basically became the superpower design. As the superpower design was becoming successful, the railroads were getting behind this. And the Advisory Mechanical Committee was created in 1929 to act as a central design bureau for the Erie Railroad, the Chesapeake and Ohio, the Pere Marquette, and the Nickel Plate. The AMC coordinated the designs and specifications of everything from locomotive and passenger cars to even stations. One of the first AMC designs was the Chesapeake and Ohio T1, which was a 210-4 superpower locomotive. The Nickel Plate Road, jumping on the AMC design of the C&O T1, scaled down just a little bit and made their locomotives the 284 Berkshire wheel design. With 69-inch drivers and 245 pounds of boiler pressure, the 700s were rated for a little bit over 64,000 pounds of tractive effort. Other appliances that the 700s were equipped with were Type E superheaters, thermic siphons in the firebox, Baker valve gear, a Worthington S feedwater heater, and an MB stoker. The tenders had a capacity of 22 tons of coal and 22,000 gallons of water. The locomotives were painted black with gold lettering on the tender and numbers under the cab. Also, the initials of the railroad were applied to the sand domes. The front end of the locomotive had the flying number boards with the bell between them and a headlight with a visor and the number plate at the center of the smoke box. Later on, the Nickel Plate Berkshires were equipped with a Mars light above their headlight on the smoke box to give it that famous nickel plate look. The Berkshires proved to be a winner for the Nickel Plate Road. They were numbered the 700 series and labeled the S class for the railroad. Delivered in September of 1944, the 765 was one of the best documented locomotives of her class. She was a favorite among crews pulling fast freights for the Nickel Plate as well as passenger trains. The 765 also had the distinction of being the final Nickel Plate Berkshire in steam when it was used as a stationary boiler in the East Wayne Roundhouse in December of 1958. It also pulled the last steam-powered nickel plate passenger excursion, a June 11, 1958 East Wayne to Chicago round trip. After the 765 was retired, the city of Fort Wayne requested a Berkshire for display at Lawton Park downtown. The city wanted the 767, which was the first Berkshire to pass over the elevated nickel plate downtown, but it was in such bad shape that the railroad renumbered the 765 to 767 and donated it to the city. The 765, now numbered 767, was put on display in Lawton Park on May 4, 1963. You may ask now, how did the 765 come out of the park, be restored to operation, and become such a famous excursion engine? But the story actually starts with another nickel plate Berkshire, number 759, which was owned by the Steamtown Foundation in Bellow Falls, Vermont. Excursion entrepreneur Ross Rowland and his high iron company were looking for a large superpower locomotive to pull its high iron excursions, and the 759 was leased from Steamtown. The 759 was restored to operation in the Nickel Plate Conneaut Roundhouse in Ohio. In 1969, it pulled the Golden Spike Centennial train from New York to Utah. This train was to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the driving of the Golden Spike. While pulling the Golden Spike Centennial, some members of the future Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society saw the 759 in operation and had a dream to get the 765 out of the park in Fort Wayne and run it on excursions himself. In 1972, the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society was formed, and by 1979, the 765 was restored and under steam. The locomotive entered excursion service, but it got its big break in 1982 when it was leased to the Southern Steam Program, pulling excursions all through the Southeast. After the Southern Steam Program, she proved to be a star and was pulling trains all over the eastern part of the United States, including the world-famous New River trains that ran from Huntington to Hinton, West Virginia, in the beautiful fall foliage of the New River Gorge. The engine ran in service until 1993 when she was due for a major overhaul. After a builder spec overhaul, she was restored back to service in 2005 and entered public excursion service in 2009 once again. Since returning to excursion service, the 765 has accomplished many new accolades. It has traveled to Steamtown, Pennsylvania. It has climbed the world-famous Horseshoe Curve, and it has even operated at fast speeds of up to 70 miles an hour in the Chicago area once again. Now she has found a home on the Indiana Northeastern Railroad as part of the Indiana Rail Experience, which we'll talk about later on in this program. Now we have a special guest with us today. You've seen him many times around the 765 over the years. We're welcoming Rich Melvin, former engineer of the 765, to our podcast today. Welcome, Rich, to Steaming Along the Line, and thank you for joining us. Can you give us a little background on yourself and your railroading history?
Well, sure, Zach. I'm very glad to be with you today, and I'm honored that you chose me to be a part of your podcasts. I hired out on the Pittsburgh and Lake Erie Railroad back in 1966. I hired out there as a brakeman and worked there for a couple of years until late 67, early 68, when I got laid off or cut off, as they say in the railroad industry. P&LE was closely tied to the steel industry at the time, and when the steel industry slowed down, so did the railroad. But I found that rail operations were very interesting and that I kind of had a knack for rail operations. I kind of was able to grasp rail operations and understand them pretty well. But after I got cut off there in 67 or 68, whenever it was, I had quite a long break in service where I did not work for a railroad. I went into television broadcasting, worked for a local ABC network station, and learned video production, and that's where I learned how to do that stuff. I got back into railroading in the 80s, initially with the 4070 crew. The Grand Trunk Western Mike out of Cleveland was with them for a couple of years and then was invited to join the 765 crew in 82. I went to work for the Ohio Central in 1996. I kind of joke about that initial time on the Ohio Central because I was the part-time one-man engineers extra board. The Ohio Central was just beginning to purchase some properties in the Youngstown, Ohio area, and didn't have enough business at the beginning to have a full-time operation. So that's when I became the part-time one-man engineers extra board. I went full-time with the Ohio Central in 2000, was promoted to the superintendent of operations for the Youngstown division in 2002. But in regional and short-line railroading, you wear many hats. So in addition to being the superintendent, I was also the road foreman and the DSLE and the corporate pilot and typically the engineer on the afternoon train going south down to Negley. I resigned from the Ohio Central at the end of September in 2008, September 30th, 2008, just after the Genesee and Wyoming had purchased the railroad. They were going to eliminate my position anyway in a streamlining of personnel. And so I resigned from the railroad and stayed with Jerry Jacobson for several more years to be his pilot and do the flying that he needed for some of the business things he was still involved in. So That, long story short, that's my background in railroading.
That's a pretty extensive background you have there, from everything on boots on the ground to throwing switches to management. Short line railroading at its best, it seems like.
Well, I would agree, and the Ohio Central, in many ways, was an example of short line railroading at its best. I enjoyed my time working for Jerry.
Yeah, and we all, most of us know in the industry, have known Jerry, and we miss him dearly. And what a facility he has there in Sugar Creek. We'll be doing an episode on that facility later on, so everyone will have to tune in for that one. Another story on the railroad.
That'll be a good one. Visiting that age of steam roundhouse is like walking back 100 years in time.
Yes. I've never been to a place like that before. So, Rich, you said you joined the 765 crew in 1982. What was your role with the 765 crew, and what did it develop into?
When I joined the crew, I joined in the winter of 82, 83 via an invitation from Gary Bensman. I joined that crew because I had grown a little dissatisfied with being with the 4070 crew. They were not keeping up very well with maintenance. They were just kind of using up the locomotive and had no long-term vision for the future, as evidenced by the fact that it has not run in decades. But when I joined the 765 crew, I found myself suddenly in a whole different world regarding the locomotive. These guys were serious. They took a long-range view of the locomotive's life. They kept up with the maintenance as far as the budget would allow. And the evidence of their stewardship is the engine's still operating today. I mean, it had a number of years where it was out of service waiting for grant money to get overhauled, but they're on good, solid financial ground, and the engine is still operating today. And I am very proud that I'm a life member of that Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society.
Great. And so you became the operations manager for the 765 with your extensive railroading background. Could you explain to us a little bit what it takes behind the scenes and what goes on with host railroads before the engine even gets to their tracks and rails to operate on?
Sure. I took over that position in 1985, as I recall, and developed a good plan of action for developing an operating plan with each railroad. I always visited the rail venue ahead of time, and when I say ahead of time, I mean months ahead of time. I would always meet with the division level officers before I would set up any corporate level meetings. I did that so I could learn the operation, learn the track names, the layout of the tracks where we would operate. And ultimately, that allowed me to prepare a written operating plan showing literally every move the 765 would make while on the property. And because I had met with the division level guys, I could speak their language. I could say we're going to need to set up on the west passing track and then spot over on the river track for water. You know, I could use their track names, and it would make sense. A lot of this planning went on, as I said, months before, but it all came together when the operating plan, for example, would say, when you pull into Altoona, we will stop at 9th Street for water. And when we stopped at 9th Street, it was no accident that there was a fire hydrant 2 hose lengths away, because I had been there 3 months before that. When I met with the corporate officials, I always assumed an attitude of what I would call quiet confidence. Quiet in the sense that we were always a guest on someone else's property, so I never went into one of these meetings making demands. It was always an attitude of cooperation. And confident because I knew I had a good crew behind me that made my job easy. If I told the railroad we were going to do something and we could do this on this day and do it this way, I knew that we could do it on that day and that way because the crew behind me was such a great group of guys and gals.
And I think that shows 100% with the professionalism and, like you said, how successful the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society has been. all the railroads it's operated on and all the successful trips it's pulled. You know, and I'm glad you're able to go into detail with this a little bit, because a lot of the quote-unquote rail fans think it just, you put a trip together, you sell the tickets, and then you come ride and go home. But like you said, it's months and sometimes even years ahead of time that goes into the planning and operations to make this all a success.
It does indeed, Zach. And a cute little anecdote, if you will, when we ran out into St. Louis as part of the Norfolk Southern program, I think we went out there in 2013, something like that. I went out to St. Louis and drove around out there, met with the guys and so forth, and I kept track of my mileage. And when I got back home off of that trip, the total mileage I had traveled was 2,101 miles.
Wow.
2101. Now, where have we heard that number before in the steam locomotive industry?
We've heard that number somewhere before. Wow, so that's crazy to think, and that's road mileage. Speaking of miles, being on the crew, the 765 since 82, 83, how many miles do you think you've logged in on the Burke before?
Well, you know, I've been asked that question before, and I wish I had kept a log, but I didn't. But given that we had run the engine almost 150,000 miles total before it went back into the shop in 93 for the big overhaul, I would have to hazard a guess that I have run it somewhere between 60 and 70,000 of those miles.
Wow.
Early on in our time when we were running excursions in the early 80s, there were still some guys around working for the railroad that had steam experience, some of the older road foremen and senior engineers. And of course, at that time, the railroad didn't know us. We didn't have any track record. We didn't have a reputation of performance yet. And so for the first several years, the railroad assigned one of their engineers to run the locomotive. We didn't run it ourselves. That slowly changed as the railroads got more comfortable with us and as those old heads retired and they didn't have anybody left that had any steam experience. So we became the guys with the steam experience.
So with all these miles you've had on the 765, I'm sure you have a long list, but do you have some of your favorite trips that stand out in your mind that you'd like to elaborate on?
Well, you know, there's so many that I did. When you told me you were going to ask me that question, I kind of went back and picked my memory a little bit. And yeah, there's some that come to mind that have never been spoken about before. I guess the first one was in July of 1988. We went up to Buffalo to run a series of trips from Buffalo up to Niagara Falls and back over the July 4th holiday weekend. We ran 3 trips a day for 3 days in a row. Well, that was kind of unusual for us because it gave me an opportunity to run the same piece of railroad multiple times. And when you do that, you can begin to develop the right places to apply the brakes, to slow down for this signal and for this switch and to go around the Y. You know, you pick out your braking points and you get them figured out pretty well. Those trips went very well. We had a good time and worked with the same road foreman each day. After the trips were over, the next day after the trips, when we were getting set to begin our deadhead move to the next stop, this road foreman came up to me and motioned that he'd like to speak with me. He pulled me aside from the group and offered me a job.
That's when you know you're doing something right.
Exactly. I had to say thanks, but no thanks, and politely decline the offer. But I was certainly honored that he had extended that offer. Another little story that comes to mind is after one of the New River trips, we had been working with senior train master on CSX down there, a fellow by the name of Dan Chenoweth. Dan was the guy that handled all of the operations in 1991 when we were down there with the 1225 and the side-by-side running and so forth. So, you know, Dan was a very experienced guy. That same year, 1991, after the convention, of course, later in October, we ran the new river trains. The first weekend, I think I was running west. Tom Stevens had run east. So by running west, I'm terminating my run in the station at Huntington at the end of the trip. As the people were getting off, I had gotten down, was standing on the platform with some of our other crew members as we waited for the passengers to get detrained. And Dan Chenoweth came up to us. He was a nice guy, but he was a no-nonsense railroader. He came up to us and just like this said, "Who was running this train tonight?" And I thought to myself, holy crap, what did I do? And I turned to him and I extended my hand and I said, "Dan, I was running tonight." And he looked at me, extended his hand, shook my hand and said, "Damn fine job." Turned around and walked away.
Oh, man.
That's just the way he was.
Yep. Yeah, I remember Dan a little bit with my family working for CSX there. I remember Dan and Jim Ward was always on the engine a lot as a road foreman. Dave Midkiff was down there a lot. So, like you say, no-nonsense railroaders, but railroading men at their finest were those guys.
I would agree with all three of those guys. Yeah, yes. I enjoyed working with every one of them. We had another incident more recently. In 2015, we were headed for Youngstown to run some trips out of Youngstown, and we're running east on the Nickel Plate, and then we have to go around a connection in Ashtabula, Ohio, to get on the Youngstown line to go south to Youngstown. The first 4 miles of this Youngstown line from the Y off the Nickel Plate are a very steep grade because you're climbing up from the level of the lake up to the level of the surrounding land. So Carson Hill, which is what this is called, was a very, very tough pull. Gary Bensman was running on this particular trip, and the railroad had been asked to lightly grease the rails on the curve on the Y. Now, when I say lightly grease, I mean all you need to do is put a very thin trail of grease on the inside edge of the outside rail on the curve. That's all you need, just to give the flange a little easier time as it guides the engine around the curve. What we ended up with was grease slathered all over the tops of both rails all the way around the Y. So Gary got about 3 car lengths into this Y and slips and stalls because the rails are all greased. So we've got two problems now. We've got to get a ton of sand on the rail, and we actually ended up getting buckets of sand and scoops and walking ahead of the locomotive and dumping sand on the rail. And now Gary's got to get this train up the hill with no running start. He was going to be able to come around the Y at 10 miles an hour, but now we're starting from nothing. And we had the entire train of 29 cars plus 4 cars of coal and a diesel on the rear end for the turning move that we would do down in Youngstown, where we actually had to have the train pulled backwards for about 5 miles. So that's what the diesel on the rear was for use later on the turning move. So we've got a heck of a train. The guys on the tool car said that at one point, according to the GPS, they were down to 0.68 miles per hour. You have some pictures that I sent you of the engine cresting Carson Hill, and you'll notice there's this towering plume of smoke out of the stack, which is kind of unusual for 765, and the pops lifted. That is because Gary told Jason Subsinski, who was firing, that we're going to need more than 245 PSI to get up this hill. So Jason was actually firing against the pops and had the pressure up around 260 in order to make the grade and not stall on that hill. And they just barely made it.
Wow.
But they did make it. And it's an indication of the superpower concept, in the sense that here's an engine working all out to maximum capacity and yet still has some extra firing ability to make more steam than the engine can use, even under that situation. It's the epitome of what superpower meant when Lima designed that type of engine with those big fireboxes and lots of great area.
Yes, and like you said earlier in this podcast, we talked a little bit about the superpower design, so that'll make the all the old heads that are still left from Lima smile really big that when we tell this story. And as you said, for our viewers that's watching this podcast, you've provided us with some video of this, and the video will be showing right now, showing the engine topping the grade at Carson Hill.
Gotcha.
So Rich, with all the good trips, obviously in your tenured career, there's some bad trips as well. Is there any of those you care to elaborate on, or any of those you could share publicly with us?
Yeah, I can mention a couple. The New Jersey in 1988 was probably some of the worst trips we ever ran, and it was due to both bad planning on the host organization's part and inexperience on my part. I learned a lot about how to plan operations from the mistakes made in New Jersey in 1988. These trips ran on Conrail, and Conrail had instituted the 40-mile-per-hour speed limit. And one of the trips that was planned was in excess of 400 miles round trip at 40 miles an hour. That doesn't work.
The math's not adding up there.
Do the math. It doesn't work, and we could not convince them that we couldn't run from Bound Brook, New Jersey to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and back, and still get back at any decent time. Well, the bottom line is we never did make it to Harrisburg. There were a number of people on the train who were planning to connect with an Amtrak train in Harrisburg to go home, because this was the last trip of the convention. They ended up having to get 21 taxi cabs to get these people to Harrisburg to get there in time for them to make their connection on the train. And the 765 and the passenger train never did make it there. We ended up turning after we took coal and went back to Bound Brook, and we still didn't get back to Bound Brook until about 2 o'clock in the morning. It was a horrible trip.
Wow.
There were other issues, too, regarding planning. We had, let me think, I'm debating whether I should tell you this story.
I get it.
I will. One of the issues that we always had to be concerned with back in that era was watering the passenger cars. At that time, in that era, most of the passenger cars relied on a water spray over the condenser in the air conditioning system to make the AC function. And we had discussed this with our host organization, and they assured us, oh yeah, we'll get you all set up for that. This is one of those learning experiences that I mentioned earlier, that because I did not go to New Jersey ahead of these trips to confirm everything. We get to New Jersey, and they have a track spotted for us where we're going to store the train, and it's kind of along the backyards of a residential area. Now, when we would typically water passenger cars, we would use a 2.5-inch fire hose hooked up to a hydrant or a pumper. That hose would go to a 3-way splitter where we would take 3-inch-and-a-half hoses so that we could water 3 cars at a time. And even at that, it would take 15 or 20 minutes to refill a passenger car, even with those big hoses. We pulled the train into this spot, the track where they were going to spot us in New Jersey. And as I said, it was behind some residential house. And the rep from New Jersey said, oh, yeah, we made an arrangement with that guy right there at his house to use his garden hose.
Oh, my goodness.
It would have taken a week to water the train with a garden hose. So obviously we had issues with air conditioning on those trips because not all the cars got refilled. And it was just, as I said, it was a good learning experience for me because from that point on, we never again had any incidents like that because I learned what to look for. And, I can't put all the blame on the guys in New Jersey. I have to share some of the blame for not doing the proper pre-planning on this myself. But it sure did make sure the trips from 1989 onward went a lot smoother.
Understand. And I've working with you on the 765. I've heard you tell some of those stories before, and you have a famous saying that I always laugh at. That you spent what was it? You spent a year and a week in New Jersey.
Well, spent a year in New Jersey 1 week.
I love it. So, to all the rail fans out there, it's not all glory and everything goes perfect. There are things that happen behind the scenes that do make the days long and hard for all of us on the engine crews and the crews that staff the train as well. So, and
an incident like this has a domino effect, Zach.
Yes,
because the deadhead to go home was when we had the incident where we almost ran out of water. I write about this in my book about the 765, but we had get home-itis. And because of that, we overlooked things on the deadhead home, and it was just a nightmare. Let me just leave it at that.
Understand. And speaking of your book, we're going to talk about that at the end, and where people can pick up a copy of your book as well. So thanks for throwing that in there. So I'll put up a link for that and everything, so people can enjoy your stories as well.
Okay.
All right. So we've got the bad out of the way. You were on the crew for a long time. You officially pulled the pin in 2016 after 34 years on the crew. Can you tell us how special your last trip operating the 765 was, and what you had a couple special people riding the cab with you on that trip? Can you go into that story with us?
I ran my last trip on what was then my home railroad, the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad. And on the last leg of the last trip, I had arranged for my two grandsons, Matthew and Nathaniel, to ride in the cab with us. I had not talked about or even thought about any video of this because I was going to be busy with my operating responsibilities. When I got up in the cab with the boys, there was a young man there with a video camera. And it turns out he was a videographer from Trains magazine. And at the time, they were producing what was going to be a new DVD about big steam operations in the United States. When he realized what he was shooting, I think he did a lot more shooting in the cab than he otherwise would have, and ultimately got permission from Kalmbach Media to give me everything he shot that day, as long as I didn't use it for commercial purposes. So I ended up with a wonderful video of me running my last trip with my grandsons in the cab with me. In that final passenger stop at Akron, Ohio, we all three put our hands on the whistle and blew one last long blast that ultimately rang down the curtain on my 50-year career in the railroading industry.
And I appreciate you sharing that video with us, Rich, and working with you on the 765. We've had a lot of smiles before when we get off the engine and everything, but when you all stop there in Akron, I've never seen a smile on your face like that when you and your grandsons as you blow the whistle and hug each other. So I know that was a really special moment for you all. It's something they'll never forget, and just personally would like to congratulate you on such a successful railroading career with the 765.
Well, thank you, Zach. It was indeed a very, very special moment. And there was another secondary special moment, so to speak, that did not make it on the videotape, because when I got off the engine there, John Jaros was at the foot of the steps at the gangway to shake my hand. At the time, John Jaros was the youngest engineer on the 765 crew. So the old guy shook hands with the young guy, and I think it was a good symbol of how seamlessly the transition went to other younger men taking over the operations planning, and the fact that the organization is enjoying such wonderful successes today is evidence that this transition went well, and the new younger generation is now running the show, and they're doing a fantastic job.
And that's what it's all about, is passing the torch. And I've been lucky to work with people like you, Scott Lindsay, Bob Saxton, some of the older heads, quote unquote, from the 80s and 90s that run these engines. I've always said these are you all and Saxton and Scott. Y'all are the closest to the real steam railroaders from the 40s and 50s. So teaching my generation is just something that means so much, and really that's what's going to keep these things going and keep them successful moving forward.
Yeah, I agree. Totally agree.
All right, so Rich, you retired from the 765. There's been many people that's come through that organization through the year, but there's one person in particular I think we both want to give a shout out to, because without their dedication to the engine, to the historical society, it would just simply not be what it is today. Could you tell everyone what Glenn Brindle was to the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society? And Glenn had a line, "Whatever it takes." And can you elaborate a little bit of what Glenn's "Whatever it takes" motto still carries true today with the 765?
I sure can, and I think the first thing I would say about Glenn is that he was my best friend. Glenn was a officer in the Indiana Air Guard, and he worked in videography and photography. And at the time that we were doing a lot of things together, I was doing a lot of video work for the model train industry, and Glenn and I worked together on scores of videos in that era. And so we did a lot of traveling together, a lot of talking together, a lot of daydreaming together. And I can tell you that the daydreams we had about the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society back then were, we couldn't even conceive of what they're doing today. Glenn was the guy that managed the overhaul. Glenn was also one of the initial 4 men who formed the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society back in 1972. Glenn was joined with Wayne York, Walter Suspenhausen, and John Eichmann, the 4 guys that formed the group. Wayne York is the only remaining member of the group that's living. Glenn was one of these guys that always had his eye on the future. He always said during this overhaul, which was kind of a dark time for us in terms of operations, there wasn't a whole lot going on during the time that we were overhauling the engine, but he continued to say all the time, someday we're going to get the call and we need to be ready. And that call came when Norfolk Southern tapped us to be a part of the steam program that Wick Moorman had put together back there in the 2011-2012 era. Glenn wasn't with us when that program happened, but I can tell you that when we were set to make the very first move of that program, pulling out of the east switch at the Casad Industrial Park onto the Nickel Plate Main headed east, I had the honor of being the engineer that day. And before whistling off and starting out through the switch to the main line, I said to myself, "This is for you, Glenn." Mm-hmm. And blew 2 long blasts of the whistle, and then we headed out. I'm sure Glenn was with us in spirit, but the fact is that without Glenn Brindle, I don't think the 765 would be running today, because it was his vision that kept the overhaul going, and more importantly, kept the overhaul money coming in when we inevitably found there was always more work to do than we originally thought there was.
I couldn't agree more. And when I started volunteering up there and working with Glenn at the shop, and just seeing his goal and everything, and I vividly remember one day him at the shop saying exactly what you said: "We're going to get the call one day." and we've got to be ready for it. And like you said, we got the call, and I was lucky to be out there some in 2012 on the road with you all on the Norfolk Southern program, and it was just, like you said, I wish Glenn would have been there to see it in person, but I know he was there with us when we were pulling out of the shop that day.
Yeah, absolutely. He certainly was.
So, Rich, I appreciate you coming on here and telling some stories with us and everything. You mentioned earlier you have a book, and it's a great book. I've got a copy of it, and I need to get you to autograph it one day for me. But
I'm happy to do
where
that.
can people get this book and read more of your stories of your time with the 765?
It's available in the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society website. You can get there by going to a very easy address to remember, 765.org. That'll get you to the Fort Wayne Railroad website, and it is available there in their web store.
Okay, and we'll for our viewers on this, we'll post a direct link on the video that goes along with this podcast for that. So I give a personal recommendation of this book. It's top notch as always, and really can't thank you enough for writing a book and sharing your experiences with everyone, Rich.
Well, it was a labor of love, I can tell you that.
Rich, I'd like to personally thank you for joining us on this podcast, and I'd also like to say I would like to thank your wife, Linda, for letting you join us on this today for a few minutes. And I'm sure you got something to say about her with all of the patience and understanding of what this steam does to our blood.
I certainly do, and I affectionately refer to her always as the lovely and gracious Linda, because there were many weekends when I would come back off of a trip, having been gone for 4, 5, 6 days on a weekend, or in some cases gone for a couple of weeks on these reconnaissance trips that I would do beforehand. But one trip in particular I would think about when I came back from the trip where we had the Lewis Tunnel incident, and again, you'll have to read about that in the book. I don't think I have ever been dirtier in my life, and when I emptied my suitcase and she took a look at the clothes that I had been wearing during that incident, she could not believe how dirty they were. And she said, "I'm not sure I'm even going to wash these. I think I'm just going to throw them out."
Oh, wow.
But our wives are certainly important in this because they end up spending a lot of time alone when we're out on the road or out doing reconnaissance and so forth. And I'm lucky to have the lovely and gracious Linda in my life. We've been together now for 56 years.
Well, congratulations on that, and please give her my best regards. A personal story for me with family and the 765, my fiance Amy, her father was a career railroader, and him and his wife Andrea were married in the cab of the 765 in 1984 in Orville, Ohio. And then in 2009, they renewed their vows at North Judson when we had the engine there, and that was obviously before I knew Amy, but it's a personal history with in the labor of love and in the blood and a family experience. So that's my personal story with 765 and family.
Well, I could be mistaken, but I think I was in the cab when they got married in 1984 in Orville, because I think it was my assignment to blow the whistle at the right time after they both said "I do."
Again, Rich, I would personally like to thank you for joining us on Steaming Along the Line. We were glad to have your insight today, all the great stories, and we wish you nothing but the best in retirement. If you're interested in learning more about the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society, the 765, or even taking a trip behind the 765, they have a great thing going on in Indiana right now called the Indiana Rail Experience. The Indiana Rail Experience is a celebration of the region's remarkable railroad history and made possible through a special partnership with the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society and the Indiana Northeastern Railroad. The 2024 schedule for the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society and the Indiana Rail Experience is out and available for view. Everything from picnic trains to ice cream and wine and whiskey trains, as well as fall color trains and even Christmas trains are available for the public to enjoy. Again, check out the schedule at indianarailexperience.org. Buy tickets to support the Fort Wayne Railroad Historical Society. All proceeds from the tickets go back into the equipment and preserving railroad history. This episode of Steaming Along the Line has been brought to you by Bald Guy Promotions of Kennesaw, Georgia. With over 32 years of experience in the printing and promotional products industry, Bald Guy Promotions is your one-stop shop for embroidered and screen printing apparel, bags, drinkware, office, trade show, pins, and more. Please visit their website at www.baldguypromotions.com and phone number is 770-361-5253. Thank you again to all of our listeners and viewers as we went steaming along the line with Rich Melvin and the Nickel Plate Road 765.